Welcome to the Stars Insights video podcast. Today we talk with Dr. Parag KHANNA, founder and managing partner of FutureMap, a strategic advisory firm based in Singapore. As you can see in these pictures, Parag has been a regular speaker at Stars programs. Today he will share with us his view about what the world will look like after the coronavirus pandemic eventually fades, how we can rethink supply chains for a world in constant flux, and how companies can build resilience today to be ready for increased volatility in the future. Let's go to Singapore now and let's get right into it. You recently wrote that the next 3 to 5 years will remind us that the coronavirus pandemic was in fact just the lightning before the thunder. So I'm wondering, what do you expect the thunder to be, and what will the world look like after the storm?
I guess you could say it's a rolling thunder, one of those long, rumbling, growling kind of thunders that appears to come from one place, then another place, and then all around, because that seems to be what's happening. We should, to some degree, see some of these things coming, because obviously when you have the staggering high levels of public debt, you're going to have very tough economic measures that need to be taken. That could lead to governments falling. You're seeing what's happening with negative oil prices, combined with the number of countries that have to draw on IMF credit lines. So that there's going to be sovereign debt issues. There's going to be serious contraction in economies that are commodity export dependent. So that's going to have knock-on effects that could have geopolitical implications. Both of those phenomena could have implications for migration, obviously. More broadly, you can imagine that people will be wanting to leave red zone countries that have not handled the virus well and move to green zones or blue zones that are more climate resilient. Switzerland obviously comes to mind as a green zone and a blue zone. So that is a likely phenomenon once borders potentially reopen again. One thing that happened with the financial crisis was that you obviously saw a substantial number of premature redundancies in the labor market. People who were at their professional peak, age 50, 55, being laid off, never finding work again. That's obviously going to happen now. Take a pilot. When you get on a plane, typically you see a pilot. It's often someone in his 40s or 50s. Well, airlines are laying off pilots by the tens of thousands. They may never work ever again, right? Then fertility absolutely crashed after the financial crisis. Across the entire world, from the year 2008 to 2009, the number of babies born collapsed. That's literally going to happen again, right? So these things play themselves out over different time cycles. Some impacts we see within 6 to 12 months, others maybe 6 to 12 years.
Another scenario is the regionalization of the world economy. Do you see that as the next level of globalization?
Yes and no. There are some things that are still very global and more global than ever. Digital connectivity is as global as ever. Global capital markets are also very global. So on the one hand, you see investors pulling hundreds of billions of dollars assets out of emerging markets. On the other hand, a lot of emerging markets now have long-term maturity debt in their own currencies and in euro and dollar bonds that have been globally invested in and subscribed. And you have capital account opening in many countries that's drawing in trillions of dollars of capital. So you still have global capital markets and global digital connectivity, but global supply chains in energy and manufacturing have been and will continue to regionalize as a result of the falling cost of technology, 3D printing, tariff and trade-related issues, trade war issues. The United States trades more with Canada and with Mexico than it does with China. That has nothing to do with the coronavirus. That has to do with the trade war and with other political pressures. Europe has mostly internal trade. That's been the case for generations, for decades. The same is true of Asia over the last 20 years. So the world has been moving from a goods trade standpoint, largely in a regional direction. It also has to do with the deglobalization of global oil, right? Global oil demand has collapsed, and in any case, we have a diversification of energy supply generation. European countries have, to a large degree, have grid parity. You have growing investment in alternatives and renewables. You have the regionalization of global gas supply as well. Every region of the world has natural gas, and as we transition towards natural gas, there's less need for global oil. So there's some ways in which we de-globalize and regionalize, and some of those are very good. It's not a good thing to be shipping oil in containers all over the world. It's actually not a healthy thing for our planet, and it's not necessary. So deglobalization in that area is a wonderful thing to celebrate. So we need to increase our regionalization in order to cope with disruptions to globalization. Why should we depend on just-in-time, critical supplies for critical goods or agriculture? So I think that there is a balance eventually, and the balance between global and regional, it should not be a philosophical issue. It should be based on need and common sense.
The origin of the pandemic in China's industrial heartland could possibly accelerate the diversion of manufacturing away from China. Does Southeast Asia stand to benefit? Which industries or countries could possibly benefit most?
Southeast Asia has been benefiting from global manufacturing supply chain shifting out of China for 10 years. It's not new news. It has nothing to do with the pandemic. It's only being accelerated by the pandemic. But it has to do with largely with Japan. Japan has historically been one of the largest foreign investors in China. They saw China's wages rising. They've had geopolitical tensions with China. So they began to divert their investment towards Southeast Asia. Americans have followed, Europeans have followed, even Chinese companies themselves have been offshoring to Southeast Asia because of the ability to access more liberal trade exports and trade agreements with the United States and other countries. So it has served everyone's interests, basically, to reallocate supply chains towards Southeast Asia. So this is one of the regions of the world that is most certainly, generally speaking, coming out ahead from the overall trends, and the trade war has benefited, and of course the pandemic does as well.
The exponential spread of this novel coronavirus has brought to light the vulnerability of the global supply chain due to its many interdependencies. How can we rethink global supply chains for a world in constant flux?
As a principle, almost as a mathematical principle, more connectivity means more possible ways to connect supply and demand, and therefore you have more resilience. You obviously also have more pathways for pandemics or cyber attacks and other kind of negative chain reactions, but you also can promote this resiliency and shifting of assets where needed. Fungibility of supply, in other words, is created. This is what's happened with the diversification of global oil supply, with North America becoming such a large producer, for example. So there is no right answer, but what the markets are generally doing is moving towards a model that you would call make where you sell. So you still have to have your footprint in China if you sell in China, because it will be a lot harder to sell in China and to compete in China unless you're making in China. And that's why, despite all the pressures that Washington is putting on American multinationals, they're saying, we're still going to be in China. Thank you, Mr. Trump. Even if you offer us money to nearshore, we're only going to make in America what we sell in America. So you can see Apple doing this. Apple is now making in India. It's making in Brazil. It's making in Texas. Apple will no longer make only in China. But the iPhones that it makes in Brazil and in India are not going to be sold in America, right? Nor in China. So make where you sell is what lots of companies have been doing for a long time, and now more companies will do. So if there is an optimal footprint, if you will, it's just to follow the make where you sell model.
What investments can governments and societies make today to steer the future into a more stable and sustainable direction?
What citizens are looking for and what governments need to plan for is, can they provide the healthcare, the environmental sustainability, the border security and physical security that people expect? Are they providing the right degree of connectivity if people need to move, want to move, digital connectivity as well, affordable housing? There's a laundry list of things that citizens expect and that we expect of states and governments. So again, countries that are not fulfilling those functions are going to find themselves on the losing end of emigration, of population outflow. And so, obviously this pandemic has been a wake-up call in the same way that, protectionist measures, populist movements, financial crises have also been wake-up calls that governments have to build in resiliency. In a country like Singapore, where they have very large sovereign wealth funds and savings, they've been able to write checks of $100 billion, right, as part of stimulus. Taxes in this country will not go up, despite the fact that they're writing $100 billion checks because they've saved for a rainy day. So let me ask you and all of your viewers, has your government saved for a rainy day? Now, every individual needs to have that checklist. What if, right? What if the next rolling pandemic, quarantine comes? Do I want to be living in a tiny overpriced apartment? Do I live near a park? Is there food? Is there a good hospital? Is my government offering, COVID-19 tests or for free or not? And everyone is going to ask this question. So what governments most of all need to do the things that will retain their people, because if you're losing people, you're going to lose.
So then what kind of advice would you give to companies? How can they build resilience to thrive in the future? How can they be ready for increased volatility in the future, be it from another round of pandemics or climate change as well?
Well, we've seen what kinds of companies are benefiting, from the pandemic in terms of their resourcefulness. So, the Amazon-like companies, logistics, last mile delivery, all things digital communications, mobile payments. These are things, anything that makes it easier to retain the ability to conduct transactions, in a time of of closure of borders and of mobility, is absolutely critical. Health tech companies, biotech, pharmaceutical companies, these are sectors, and across the world I'm seeing 5 or 6 major sectors that are going to grow, that are going to benefit: agrotech, digital tech, so on, logistics, so on and so forth. So there's no doubt that there are economic areas that are winning. So what can companies do? Obviously they have to maintain their own, again, supply chain resilience, as we were discussing earlier. They need to have cash on hand, right? They need to also be more asset light as well. They need to be fungible in terms of the geography of their investment. They perhaps need to have more and more remote workers. Many of the firms that I've been talking to over the last few weeks are saying that they're not going to hire back a lot of workers in the future. They're going to focus more on remote workers and just construct their digital workforce as they need it on a project basis to lower their overhead costs. So a lot of that kind of thinking is going on at the strategic level, and I think that's probably quite wise.
As the economy falls into ruins and tax revenues are collapsing, governments are writing millions of checks to companies and households. What impact will the increased debt levels have on the economy in the medium and long term?
In the traditional playbook, I mean, we could imagine further disruptions, though, as you and I were discussing at the beginning. You could see governments collapse. You could see significant need to write down debt entirely. You'll have to shift the currency, the composition of debt, and all of these kinds of questions. So I think we're facing a much more existential reckoning than just the traditional patterns of how you deal with countries that have high sovereign debt. And I think it's anyone's guess really how those will play out. One thing, in my view about Europe, where a lot of this conversation centers, is on, either Southern Europe or emerging markets. But when it comes to Southern Europe, I still don't believe that a breakup of the Eurozone is, the right way to go. I don't think that a country like Italy or Greece is going to have a lot of backers for its debt if it moves back to its old currencies, knowing full well that it doesn't have the capacity to pay them off. So it's a much smarter idea to suffer the sort of political pain of working towards a more consolidated fiscal union in Europe. And I think that's going to be, hopefully the path that European leaders take.
Sometime down the road, after pandemic restrictions on cross-border mobility have been lifted, what do you imagine the future of migration to look like?
There are a lot of factors there. There are 7 or 8 reasons why people move, historically, in terms of large population flows over the last, say, 75 or 80 years. And, one of the principal reasons is just economic migration. Obviously, the search for opportunity, higher wages, better quality of life, to plug labor shortages, as has been the case in Europe in the post-war decades, in the Middle Eastern countries today. People fleeing civil war, and political unrest. Climate change has become a major driver of migration. Now the pandemic will drive migration. But in the end, I still believe, because it's true, that the most powerful force is supply and demand. And at the end of the day, in Europe, you have labor shortages, you have aging populations, you've not automated the infrastructure and the ability to maintain infrastructure. You can't automate, you can't have robots pay taxes, right, to pay for the generous pension systems. So in the end, immigration actually will prevail. It's just a question of which governments realize it first. And the decrease in immigration to America is being offset actually by the increase in migration to places like Canada and even Japan. In the last year, Canada absorbed 100,000 more migrants than the United States did, even though Canada has 1/10 the population of the US. So every country is acting differently, deciding how to lift migration restrictions in what time scale and the manner in which they do it. But most countries eventually become pragmatic about migration. If that were not true, we would not have the growing diversity that we have in our societies.
Thank you very much for your time and for sharing your insights.
Thank you.